Greetings, everybody. Welcome to part 2 of the winery cleanliness and sanitation series. This one in particular, I want to talk about winery sanitation. It's a little bit different than winery cleanliness in and of the fact that cleaning is one part of the equation, but sanitation is another part. And then we're going to have a third part talking about hazard analysis and critical control points. So let's go ahead and get rolling with winery sanitation. So the difference between cleaning and sanitation is cleaning is about getting rid of the bulk of the stuff. It's about getting rid of all the sugars, the acids, all the general detritus, and all the stuff that microbes either can grow on or just kind of getting rid of the cesspool that realistically a winery can be, especially during harvest. Whereas sanitation is that next step where we're attempting to reduce the number of microorganisms on the surfaces of things. So this is the idea of sanitizing and getting rid of the actual bugs. So cleaning versus sanitizing. Cleaning's removing the substrates. It's getting rid of these biofilms, and it allows sanitizers to go to work. Cleaning is more important. Day-to-day operational cleaning is always more important than the final step of sanitation for day-to-day use. Sanitation is very important that it's applied at the right time because sanitation can be extremely important, but day-to-day operations, cleaning always takes precedence. But sanitation needs to be thought out well, we'll talk about that at the end of the lecture, when you want to apply these different levels of sanitation and where you want to go with those types of things in your cellar. So the thing is, we got to talk about where do microbes come from? And the reality is everywhere. So what you're looking at in this picture is from a bucket. It's a pied de cuve. It's basically we took some grapes, we crushed them up in the vineyard and let them start fermenting. And this is what naturally showed up in the grape must. And what's really fascinating about this is when we look at it, we see the natural yeast that really do live in yeast, these little apiculate guys that look like lemons. That's Hansenia aspergillorum. And then also we see some round ones starting to show up here, and that's Saccharomyces. And these are things that just showed up in a vineyard. And we did DNA sampling on the yeast in this in particular, and none of them were commercial strains. These things just exist. So what I'm trying to tell you is microbes kind of come from everywhere, but certain microbes can come from more places. And how do they get in the winery? And the reality is there's a ton of places they can come from. First off, one of the things that always amazes me about winemakers is that they'll like sanitize the equipment completely with like steam or something before they crush fruit. And I'm like, you do realize these grapes come from a place called outside. In these vineyards, there are things called birds and mice and rodents and things like that. And there's a lot of stuff outside where there can just be general microbes all around. So it can come simply from the vineyard. The other thing is that we do some, maybe some foot stomping or foot, equipment, or we may, use different types of equipment in the winery. There's a lot of places for microbes to hang out. Barrels are an absolute nightmare. They can transport all kinds of wonderful things into your winery. If you are a startup winery or you haven't made a lot of wine and you're thinking about buying used barrels, some of the biggest outbreaks of bad stuff I've ever found in wineries have come from used oak, so I want you to be very cautious about that. And then also, we can take a look here at one of these bins here, and you can just see how rapidly ferment can overflow and stain not only your bin, but also can transport all sorts of things into your winery. So microbes have a huge number of entry points into the winery, whether it be from fruit coming into the winery from outside, from people that are working on the wine, from our winery equipment, from the bins themselves transferring in and out of vineyards, and we'll talk a little bit about bin sanitation at the end. People's shoes, if they choose not to take off their feet and their shoes and sanitize them before they decide to stomp something into a press, which I find this picture quite amusing. And then on top of that, life is the inevitable place that all things end up. And grape must is such a rich environment for all types of microbial growth. There's just little to no doubt that things are going to come along where there's food. And you like grapes, I like grapes, and microbes sure like grape juice. So they're going to follow that train, and so they can come to enjoy all the delicious food that is grape juice. So let's talk about sanitizers. So first off, we're going to clean, and so remember that cleaning part, but now we're going to talk about sanitizing. So after we clean, what are some of the things that we use commonly in a winery to add that next step of sanitation. So the top one is a sodium percarbonate or sodium peroxycarbonate or sodium peroxyhydrate. I've heard it pronounced a lot of different ways. I've heard it typically shortened to peroxycarb, so I'm going to use that as the default position here. Peracetic acid is also something very commonly used in winery scenario. Quaternary ammonia is really nice. I'm going to talk about that. Iodophors or iodines, we'll talk about those. Hot water and steam, which I like a lot. Ethanol and ozone and UV light, because that has been a topic of conversation over the last couple of years, and talk about some of the studies and things that I've run into over the years on those different sanitizers that we use in the winery. So sodium percarb is one of the most commonly used, especially in small winery scenarios. We like to use soda ash in small wineries. Big wineries like to use caustic soda because it's so effective, but in smaller wineries, we use a lot of hand work, and caustic soda and hand work don't necessarily get along well. So sodium percarbonate is really nice. It's a combination of soda ash and hydrogen peroxide. So you've got your alkaline cleaner with the soda ash, pH 11-ish cleaner, which is really good for cleaning and getting rid of all sorts of sugars and acids and breaking things down. But also you get this added sanitation effect by using hydrogen peroxide. So it's good at removing fats and oils and tartrates, and additionally it has this extra step of microorganisms. So this is something that you can use in your cleaning step that adds a sanitation effect, which is pretty neat. The downside is you don't want to get your hydrogen peroxide in your wine. Peroxide is an oxidizer, and it also binds up with SO2 to become sulfuric acid, which actually can be a good thing in places where it's legal, but that's another thing entirely. But primarily, we don't want to get this in our wine. And it's also a base. So you wouldn't want to get a strong base or a moderately strong base in your acidic wine and end up neutralizing your wine. So we do have to have an acidic rinse afterwards. Downside is, again, we're throwing some sodium down the drain. And now if you're on an evaporation pond, probably not such a big deal, but if you're going to be using this water, recycling your water for irrigation, that sodium can become an issue for soil aggregation. So other things are, it's not as strong as caustic soda, and if you tend to have sensitive skin, it certainly can be an irritant. All right, now on the other side of that basic cleaner, we can have our acidic sanitizer. So we want to do peracetic acid, and this is something that's really come on strong in the last decade or so. I was hesitant to use it early on because I didn't like the smell of it because it's acetic acid. But a friend of mine, Jake, came out and said, hey, Tim, the reason I love this stuff is I know when I walk in the cellar if my crew is doing the right thing. If it smells like peroxyacetic acid or peracetic acid, it's been cleaned. And once I kind of got into that and I started using it in my cellar, I noticed such a dramatic difference in just the black slime molds that generally grow on the floor instead of using citric acid, because a lot of people were using citric acid and still do use citric acid for their neutralization step. Citric acid grows everything in it. It's really pretty nasty stuff. So we want to get away from using citric, whereas acetic acid is an end-line metabolite. Nothing except for people really eats acetic acid. No microbes really like it. It's not high on the list of things that microbes want to consume. So we like acetic acid. And then the pair part is the hydrogen peroxide. And you'll notice that peroxide has really come into play quite a bit in the wine industry. So essentially we have acetic acid and peroxide. It neutralizes that basic rinse. And again, that hydrogen peroxide oxidizes the cell membrane and it destroys gram-positive bacteria, molds, and yeast, which I guess yeast are really technically kind of a fungi anyway. But anyway, it really is good at breaking those things down. It's a very effective sanitizer and it's used in many industries. You can mix your own. You can buy concentrated acetic acid and you can buy concentrated hydrogen peroxide, and you can mix your own. It only takes about 1% peroxide to really do a pretty good job of breaking all these things down. So if you buy concentrated 30% peroxide, which you can do from a cleaning company fairly inexpensively, and you buy a big jug of acetic acid concentrated, you can save yourself a little money over buying the premix stuff. However, a lot of wineries are just trying to make sure that they're staying above board. So it's really nice to be able to have the proper cleaning label, the proper MSDS sheet, and it's easier to train your staff to do a single, addition to, a mix-up. So Again, always read the label, but it's highly concentrated stuff. So peroxyacetic acid typically comes in at around 20% hydrogen peroxide, and that will burn you. So you need to have proper protective equipment. You need to have safety goggles and need to have your staff trained on how to use this properly, because if you get it on you, it will burn your skin and it will burn your eyes. So it's really, really tricky stuff in its concentrated form. Once it's diluted, pretty harmless, but in its concentrated form, definitely something to pay attention to from a occupational health and safety standpoint. Another thing I want to talk about is quaternary ammonia. So in the big clean, we can do a clean and sanitize with the peroxy, carb, and peracetic acid, kind of a 2-for-1. But quaternary ammonia is this like extra little thing that you can add to your sanitation regime. It's something that I've come to use, I've come to quite like. It's not a day-to-day use thing. It's not particularly good at sanitizing large amounts of stuff, but what's great about it is it's really stable. It's really good for coating machines afterwards, after you've used them, that are going to go down for a while. So if you've got some tanks that you've done cleaning on and you're not going to be using for a few weeks, do a little quaternary ammonia spray, because Quat can actually have a sanitation effect that lasts for a few weeks, and then just a quick rinse and you can go right into that tank. So it's a really nice way to have an extended sanitation cycle for your winery. The downside is there is zero cleaning ability. It's kind of expensive. It is a powerful oxidizer, so you don't really want to get it in your wine. I've heard that you can just go straight to wine. I don't know if I would necessarily do that. And it's also one of the #1 causes of contact dermatitis, because it's used very commonly in restaurants, and in concentrated forms, you can get a little bit of skin irritation. So again, use that proper protective equipment and rinse your hands after you use it. Iodophores are great. They use them commonly in the beer industry because they like a little higher pH, and you don't need a very high dose. It's non-corrosive. The downside is it's expensive. It's a powerful oxidant, so you don't want to get your wine. You need a fairly long contact time. And the last thing I don't have here written down is it dyes everything orange. If you've ever gotten surgery or anything like that, and they put the iodine on you, it'll dye everything orange. And you'll have a particular sheen to your skin that may not be so appealing. And so a lot of people don't like to use iodophores because they do dye things. But it is a nice little extra thing that you can include in your sanitation regime from time to time. Again, always trying to change your spectrum of different microbes you're going to work on. So maybe from time to time you do an iodine rinse. Or you do some quaternary ammonia, just again to keep those background things guessing, and keep anything from adapting to your day in and day out sanitation regime that's always the same thing. Ethanol is fantastic sanitizer. I highly recommend it. You need to have a dilution. I put 50% on here realistically, probably a little more like 60 to 75%. And the reason that you want a dilution is that basically what happens is if you spray pure ethanol on a microbe, it'll just embolize it, and it'll just become just sort of, it won't kill it. It'll just make it shrivel up. Whereas if you add water, water helps carry the ethanol across the cell membrane into the microorganism, and it will kill it. So it makes it more effective if you are using it at 65–70% concentration. It's good for small surfaces, sampling valves. It's something you want to have around all the time. Really, really good for sanitizing barrels and bungholes before you get into it. We'll talk about it a little bit more in barrel sanitation. It's good for valve gaskets. And when you're setting up a bottling line, really nice to spray into all those little N-Buna gaskets that crack and get things in it. It's a really effective tool. The downside is it's really expensive. The Tax Trade Bureau wants you to track it all. And also, you've always got the seller hands that will drink cleaners. I did have an individual that I was working with once, and we put a bunch of phenolphthalein indicator in one of the Everclear bottles, and it acts as a tremendous laxative. So if you ever want to find out who is snaking your Everclear, I don't recommend that, because it would be illegal and terrible thing to do. So don't do that. UV light. UV lights come on strong, and especially as we're looking for ways to use less water. It's really, really good for some stuff, and maybe not terribly good for others. The research is still out on it. It's really good for bug control. It's really good for surface sanitation. And when I mean bug control, it's good for, like, I don't know, fruit flies. And it's also really good for something that wineries will set up in the background, UVC especially. We learned in COVID, a lot of people started using UV light and things like this. And you could turn on these UVC lights when nobody's in the building, and it'll sanitize the air. So it's a really good background sanitizer. But there's also another company out there that's putting them in tanks and sanitizing the tank from the inside out. I've heard different remarks from people, so I'm not going to pass judgment on it yet, but there's no surface penetration. So if there's any shadow, I don't see how it's going to sanitize on the other side of that. If there's any biofilms or dirt or anything like that, you'll have some issues getting through it. And also having high-powered bulbs and things like that. And another thing is, I've gotten in a fight with one of these once where I was standing a little close to it, and I thought I was shielded, but I wasn't. And it hit my eyes, and it burned my eyes pretty good. It didn't happen right away, but later in the evening, my eyes started to hurt really, really bad. So it doesn't seem like something that's injuring you initially, but can definitely have some impacts on people. So I recommend that. Something to watch, test, trial. Could be good, could be bad. Not 100% sold on it just yet, but it does have some potential, because if we could use this instead of traditional sanitation, we could save millions of gallons of water in the wine industry. So I would say watch this space. The jury is still out, but has some promise, but could still have some drawbacks. Gonna keep watching this to see what research tells us as time moves on. Ozone. Ozone was gonna save everybody. The thing is, back in the day, we used chlorine for everything. I'm talking about chlorine here in a second. The reality is, ozone was going to be the end-all to be all. In the late 90s, it's coming. Late 90s, 2000s, we couldn't use chlorine anymore, and boom, ozone was going to save the day. And so everybody went out and bought an ozone machine. And so the advantages to ozone are, it's a colorless gas, it's a very powerful oxidizing agent, it has a half-life in water of about 20 minutes, but it tends to dissipate, and it does go away. There's nothing that goes down the drain. It just goes away. The vapor density is really heavy. It's much heavier than air, which means it likes to sink and sit in barrels and sit in tanks. It's soluble in water, is about 10 milligrams per liter at 0 degrees C, so really cold water can hold quite a bit of it. But it takes quite a bit of concentration to be really effective as a killer of microbes, so 1 to 5 parts per million against wine microbes. But again, this upside is nothing goes down the drain. The downside is, this is a toxic gas. Anybody who's ever worked with ozone at a reasonable concentration will tell you this stuff will burn your nose and it will make you cough, and it is not a lot of fun to be around. It's also that powerful oxidizing agent. It's going to wreck barrels. If you put it in barrels, it's going to be hard on your lignin. It's going to be hard on some of the other things in barrels. Not that steam's any better, but it does have a pretty short life as a gas, but in liquid it can deliver a lot more. And the downside is that, and one of the things you can't see with the screen in the way, is the odor threshold's about 0.1 to 0.2, 0.02 to 0.1 milligrams per liter. And the toxic threshold to humans is less than a milligram per liter. So to get the strength high enough to be really effective against wine microbes, you're going to be starting to put a lot of pressure on the health and safety of your cellar staff. So while in theory it's a good idea, getting the concentrations at reasonable levels to be able to be the end-all to be-all sanitizer for your cellar is probably going to be pretty difficult to do. However, what ozone does do well, and much in the way that UV light does, is that ozone gas can be something you can program to be dumped into your winery at, say, 2 or 3 in the morning when no one's there, and really help to keep background microbe growth down. It also can help to keep bugs, literal bugs like fruit flies, down. So it does have some advantages. What I really like it for is those people that want to just take that extra step, that little extra thing that goes a little bit further. So if you're doing you want to do a little extra rinse, you want to do one little extra step in your day-to-day operations to add a little bit of sanitation effect, I think it's very good for that. The research has shown it isn't particularly good for barrel maintenance in terms of keeping Brettanomyces down, especially in comparison to steam. But it is a nice little extra thing. and I don't begrudge anybody for wanting to use it. I think it's just if you want to have one little step up where you're adding a nice extra polish to your facility and want to have one extra step that you know that you're adding a little bit of sanitation in the background, great. But it is not going to fix your whole winery situation. We tried that. I've tried that in a number of wineries. We've all run into the same situation where it was a nice little helper, but certainly not as effective as we hoped it was going to be. But again, a nice little addition if you want to have it. Hot water and steam. It's the best. For sanitation, there's a reason we've been using this in everything. It's very effective, but very dangerous. Steam carries a lot of energy. So steam can burn you pretty badly. I've definitely been burned by it. Most people I know that use it regularly have certainly caught maybe a little steam jet or bumped into something hot. It's good stuff. It works on barrels, tanks, and bottling lines. Very, very effective. There are a number of ways to get steam. You can buy a pressure washer that can go to steam generation. So most of the major pressure washer companies can do this for you if you want. Another thing you can do is you can buy a commercial steamer for wineries. And another inexpensive thing you can do, especially in a small winery scenario, is you can get online and order a sauna steamer. And sauna steamers come in a variety of sizes and shapes and power levels. And you can buy a sauna steamer and buy some of the hoses and make your own steamer for a fraction of the price of the commercial units. The thing is you've got to make sure you've got plenty of power. So if you're some small home winemaker, steam is pretty hard to generate on a home service. But in commercial settings, you're going to want to make sure that you have, around 60 amps of power at 220 at least, if not more, or 240. To be able to power a steamer, or having some 480 volt service is also really nice to be able to power a steamer properly. You're going to need a lot of energy. You can also get steam from diesel too if you have one of those, or gas if you have one of those pressure washers that's designed for it. But just realize you're using a lot of energy. That's the downside to it. How good is steam? Well, it's great, but you have to know your time and temperature. Time and temperature is absolutely everything. For bottling line prep, I've used this for as long as I've been in the industry. I think it's a fantastic guide from Practical Winery and Vineyard in 1989. So we're going back 30 plus years on this, but I think that if you want to be true in sanitation and pasteurization, which is how we pasteurize, is with heat, whenever you're using steam, you need to measure time and temperature. And the only way to do that, especially in the situation of a bottling line, is to make sure that you find the heaviest valve at the end of the bottling line that has enough weight that it's going to be the longest thing to heat up. And that's what you start measuring your temperature on. Don't measure it on the hot input line, measure it on the output. So you've got to measure at the end of that hose on the output. Once it reaches that temperature, you start to take your time. So in a bottling line, we want to see 200 degrees Fahrenheit for about 20 minutes or about 93 degrees centigrade. If you can get it up north of that, the sanitation effect is pretty quick. But the downside to this whole thing is, how can you measure this in a barrel? So for a bottling line, this is great. But for sanitizing a barrel, well, how long? And the answer to that question is, we don't know. Unless you you start measuring temperature on the outside of the barrel and wait till it gets to 200 degrees, you don't know how well you've penetrated the wood in your barrel. So you could get a thermometer and do that and get your barrels up to 200 degrees. The cost is going to be tremendous, A. B, the degradation to your wood lignin and everything else in your barrel is going to be tremendous, and you're probably not going to have a whole lot of flavor left in the barrel. It will get rid of all the tartrates and any microbes in the process, but you might lose a lot of flavor. But if you're trying to make a neutral barrel and you want to make sure you've got no flavor, this is a way to do it. So steam is great, but for wood, it is a little bit harder to make sure that you've got that barrel truly sanitized. But for academic purposes, time versus temperature for microorganisms, once you get north of 70 degrees C, most of the things we see in a winery are going to be dead in a matter of just seconds. So for stainless steel tanks, as soon as you get them hot, you get them north of 75 degrees centigrade, that tank, for all intents and purposes, is sanitized. Now, For sanitizing tanks with steam, realize it's really hard to heat a stainless tank evenly. Very hard to heat a stainless tank evenly. So in larger winery scenarios, you've got to go through a long process of heating a tank, because you can end up flexing and bending a stainless tank, and you can break jackets and things like that. So it's not as easy as it sounds. It can be a little bit challenging. This is particularly important for people that are doing kosher wine production, especially in larger winery scenarios. Being able to heat that tank evenly so that you don't crack it is pretty important. But this is that lethal zone, and give you an idea of how quick your time versus temperature needs to be in order to get that tank sanitized. And pretty much free of most microorganisms. You can't get rid of all of them, but get rid of 99+% of them in a pretty short period of time with some heat. And here's chlorine. It has a place that it needs to go, and it's in the trash can. It used to be the best cleaning agent out there. I loved chlorine. It was amazing. You could have a party coming into your winery, and 20 minutes before everybody came, you come and pour chlorine on the floor, and you'd spray it down, and all of a sudden the floor would just shine, be perfectly clean. All the microbes would be gone. Everybody walk in and just go, oh, it smells so clean in here. It's so nice. Well, the downside is it complexes with wood and molds on wood and makes TCA. And trichloranisol 2,4,6-TCA is very, very effective at tainting your wine. And when I mean tainting it, it'll make it smell like cardboard or old basement. We've all had corked wines. Well, guess what? You can have a corked winery. You can have TCA in your winery, and you can have systemic cork taint from use of chlorine and wood together. And all the wines in a winery can come out tasting like they've got cork problems. And so chlorine isn't something we get to use anymore. Keep it away from your winery, because TCA is detectable in parts per trillion, and 1 tablespoon of this stuff could manage to ruin all the wine on earth. So it doesn't take much. So this is one of those things that we don't want to keep around our winery. So if you happen to have a bucket of this underneath your sink in your winery, or you've got a restaurant on site, you may want to consider using some other things instead of a bleach on your floors and in your winery. So toss it out and say goodbye to the Clorox. So what could go wrong? And this picture has absolutely nothing to do with winemaking. I just thought it was really entertaining. My neighbor drained his pool with a crane, and so I always think in terms of what can go wrong. So what are some things that can go wrong with these different sanitation regimes? So heat can be a problem. If you don't properly clean things first, heat can bake on biofilms. It can strip flavor out of your barrels, and it's expensive. Chlorine, you've got TCA, you got to get rid of it, and so we don't want to do that. Iodophores, their problems is that they stain, they react with starch and turn everything blue. So if you're sugars or things like that, and it's not very broad spectrum, pretty narrow in what it takes care of. Quaternary ammonia, again, narrow spectrum. It's slow acting, and if you use it day in and day out all the time, you could build up some resistant microflora. So quaternary ammonia is something, again, we want to use sparingly. What could go wrong? Well, this is pretty entertaining. Again, another picture has nothing to do with anything other than the fact that one of those is Rob Halford, the other one is me. You decide which one it is. Anyway, what could go wrong? Dressing up like Rob Halford? I don't know. Nothing, I suppose. But what could go wrong? We have issues with acid anionic combinations. They're narrow spectrum, again, reactive with organics. Hydrogen peroxide, oxidizing residues, it's unstable. I mean, hydrogen peroxide, once you open the container, it's going to degrade pretty rapidly. It reacts easily with SO2, and it's inactivated by UV light. So not something that we want to use it's something that's very effective, but, again, it isn't the end all to be all. Ozone, again, dedicated equipment, worker hazards, less effective than advertised. Still, it works, but not the end all to be all. UV, poor penetration, no residual shadows. So there are some things that can go wrong. So basically what I'm saying here is that there isn't a right answer. None of these solves all of your problems, except for, steam. I suppose it can, but realistically, everything has its challenge. So you have to think about what sanitizer you're going to use, when you're going to use it, and what the right conditions are. And then rotate within those sanitizers and those regimes, depending on what you're doing and when you're doing it, in order to be effective in an overall sanitation regime for your cellar that works for the type of wine that you make. And realize that's going to be different because if you're in the Finger Lakes of New York making pH 3.0 Riesling, you're going to have very different sanitation requirements than someone, here in Walla Walla in the Rocks District making pH 4.1, 13% alcohol Syrah. These are totally different worlds. And so every different world and every different winery requires different levels of sanitation. Then are you a small artisanal winery that can accidentally screw up a batch if you're a natural winemaker and just call it terroir? Or are you a winery that's got to deliver the same profile day in and day out, and you're making millions and millions of gallons of wine, and you have no room for error? What does your sanitation protocol look like versus a small winery that's trying to be terroir expressive? They're very different. And so setting up a sanitation regime that's appropriate for your winery is important. So sanitation protocols. Cleaning has to be done first. Number one thing, must be done. You got to clean first. It's more important than sanitizing. And then choose your level of sanitation. This is why I say choose your own adventure. It's up to you. Crush pad, harvest bins, fruit holding, moderate to low, probably. Fruit does come from outside. Just a moderate clean, spray it down with a pressure washer, maybe some soft sanitizers, maybe some prophylactic ozone if you need to be. One of the things you might want to consider doing is spraying the bottom of those waffle bins. Get one of those pump up sprayers that we use kind of in your backyard for spraying weeds or whatever, but obviously not one that has been used for weeds. And mix up a strong batch of sodium percarbonate or of peracetic acid. Phylloxera does not like hydrogen peroxide. So one of the things I recommend you do is spraying the bottom of the bins to protect vineyard transmitted diseases from moving from one vineyard to the other. So after you get done cleaning your bins or any of your trucks or your tractors, spray them off and then spray them down with peracetic acid. And that can be an effective way to make sure that you as a winery aren't transmitting things that maybe, as a winemaker, we're always afraid of Brettanomyces taking over our cellars and ruining our wine. Well, vineyard managers are equally as concerned about bad microbes moving into their vineyards. So as winemakers, it's important for us to be respectful of their sites and make sure that we're spraying down our bins and keeping them really clean so we're not transmitting things from our cellar into their vineyards. Now, pre-fermentation, how clean do we want to be? Probably a good clean followed by some soft sanitizers. Again, it's going to be up to the level of cleanliness of every winery and what type of wine you're making that's going to require your level of sanitation to be different. So take that into account and realize how clean do you need to be. And also at the same time, one thing I do want to recommend too is really think about, I've been in wineries that are fairly dirty and make excellent wines because they focus on the chemistry of the wine being absolutely perfect. And because they're looking at the chemistry of the wine, the microbiology of the wine sort of has a robust immune system or moderate pH. It's got a robust, they're really focusing on yeast fermentation, kinetics, and health. And they're not worrying so much about cleaning. They're making sure that their wine has a good immune system. I've also been in wineries that make that have been immaculate, perfectly clean, and make pretty poor wine because they're spending so much time cleaning, they're forgetting to make the wine. So always kind of figure out where you need to be and what that balance is to be able to have the best outcome. But if you cannot clean and you cannot sanitize or create some regime for your winery, you might as well quit the wine industry right now because these are the two most important things to winemaking. And then pre-bottling, well, again, this idea depends on the wine. If you have a sweet white wine that's got a moderate pH and some sugar in it, you better make sure that that tank is as sanitized as you can possibly get it, or else you're going to re-ferment it. So you got to be really, really careful. Now, if you have a completed malolactic, sugar dry, high alcohol, like say Sangiovese, that's like 15.4% alcohol, that's got a pH of 3.2, nothing's going to grow in that, really. Very few microbes are going to like that environment. So how clean do you need to be? Again, it depends on the wine. So you may have different sanitation protocols for different wines, and that's totally acceptable. You may want to put a little bit more effort into wines that may have potential of re-fermentation. At bottling, it's always high to the nth degree. So in the HACCP lecture that's going to come up after this, we're going to talk about monitoring levels of DNA microbe in the background, and just how clean do we need to be to make sure that we don't have bad things going into the bottle. Bottling is the worst time for any winemaker, so your sanitation protocols at at bottling have to be paramount and beyond paramount. You will, in your career, you will unbottle wine once, maybe twice, and then after that, you will take precautions. But after you unbottle wine a few times because of mistakes that you've made, you will very rapidly realize that it's important to pay attention at that moment of bottling. I want to say click and subscribe for more. If you want to hear more from me, I'll keep posting these just for fun. I also want to give a shout out to some of my folks in the wine industry that have been influential to me. Christian Butsky has been fantastic. He's done lots of sanitation seminars over the years, and I've been to a few of them. Also Patrick Island, great books. Top notch. Definitely recommend getting them. They're out of Australia if you can afford them. They're a couple bucks, but worth it. Randy Warborough, who's outstanding, one of the best in the business for cleaning and sanitation. You can look him up. He's out of Cornell. And Bruce Zockling, the man, the myth, the legend. I've been reading Bruce since I was a kid. So I got to give him a shout out too. Also, if you have an opportunity and you're thinking about getting in the wine industry, you should certainly buy his Winery Planning and Design I guess it's CD or PDF compilations that he's got over the years. Priceless treasure trove of documents if you can buy it. I'll try to put some links up in the description to make sure that you can get a hold of Bruce if you need to. Anyway, cheers everybody, and have a good one.